What's up guys, no time to waste. Today let's go ahead and dive right into making your color grading better. If you haven't had a chance to watch part 1 of this color grading series, I would suggest you go ahead and go back and watch that real quick. Super short video, super basic video, but it's gonna be some really good fundamental things that are gonna help us with our color grading processes. And the next thing I want you to know is that the footage that I'm going to be using for examples in this video is using the Sony a7S III. That's my primary camera. That's the only camera that I use. And I shoot on picture profile S-Cinetone. Now I use this picture profile because in about 90% of the situations that I encounter as a wedding videographer, the dynamic range is plenty good enough in S-Cinetone. And because my time is precious to me and I don't want to waste a ton of time on color grading, I've chosen to compromise with the middle ground of S-Cinetone instead of using a super flat profile like S-Log3. Now S-Cinetone was made with your skin tones in mind that are in your footage, and that's why I chose to use this profile. So with that said, let's keep going. Now the first thing I want to talk about is something called white balance. I'm sure you're well versed in what white balance is, and if you are, I encourage you to stick around. I'm not going to talk about the subject long, but it is very important because not only is exposing your images properly before you go into the editing suite important, it's also just as important to nail your white balance whenever you're out in the field shooting. This is setting you up for success in the long run when you get into your editing suite and you sit down to edit your footage. You're starting off with a great clean slate of good looking exposure and good looking white balance. Now I know our cameras have 10-bit, 12-bit and RAW capabilities these days, but you're still going to not be able to beat having your footage look properly exposed in post and having correct white balance. If you start dragging your white balance slider around in post, if you have to do a ton of correction, you're gonna notice that it's gonna start affecting your skin tones, and then the whites on a window shade or a cloud or something like that is going to be off. So make sure you're nailing white balance before you actually get into the editing suite. In order to get the most accurate in-camera results for nailing your exposure and your white balance, I encourage you not to look at the back of your screen, but to use your viewfinder, blot out everything by pushing it up to your eye and look through it, especially on the Sonys. This is about as accurate of an image as you're gonna get for what your footage is gonna look like in post. If you like to use monitors, you can go ahead and get one of those as well and use tools like false color, zebra, exposure assist, all these different things that you can use that are gonna better help set you up for nailing your exposure before you get into the editing suite. Now I load my LUTs into my monitor in the field so that I have a general idea of what my footage is gonna look like in the end whenever I start putting my LUTs and stuff on it, but I generally use my monitor just so I'm motivated when I'm out in the field, not for actual exposure settings. Next thing I want to talk about is using your curves in your editing suite. Now this could be very basic for you, but we're building off of the foundation we've already built. We're going to continue moving forward and learning more about color grading. Now I personally like to use my curves in conjunction with my lumetri scope so that I can see where exactly the modifications I'm making to my curves by dragging up and down are making to my exposure values using the IRE scale. By taking the uppermost corner of your curves and dragging it up and to the left, you're going to be making your image exponentially brighter as it moves into the bright side of your exposure values. Conversely, if you go down to the very bottom of the curve slider, if you drag it down and to the right, you're going to notice that your blacks become even more crushed. So let's say you open up your footage, you open up lumetri scopes, and you're looking at your footage and you notice that it's coming nowhere close to hitting 0, which is true black, on your IRE scale, or 100, which is pure white. Then you can go in there and you can just drag down the bottom point here until you start seeing some of your footage hit that 0 on the IRE scale, maybe just a little bit. This is very situational. Then you want to go to the point at the top right and drag it up and to the left to exponentially from brightest down to darker, increase the exposure values of your footage. This is one of the biggest things that I learned to do in the beginning to make my footage pop more. If you look at your footage as you drag your exposure values up, you'll see that exponentially from the most bright part of your image down to the midtones, down to the shadows, you'll see that line exponentially decline going downwards, and that means that it's increasing the brighter parts of your footage and making them brighter and slowly dissipating that brightness increase as it goes down that line on the curves. Again, this is a really good way to make your footage pop and is one of the first things I do whenever I go in to color correct my footage. Going back to part 1 in this series, this is also a really good way of beginning to add contrast back into your images. Of course, you can go into basic correction, you can drag your shadows down, you can drag your highlights up, you can drag your blacks down, you can drag your whites up, but this is a good first step. If you've already done that and you're noticing that your footage isn't popping how you're wanting to, go ahead and drag that slider up just a little bit. Now this is situational. In some lighting situations like blue hour or something like that, you're not gonna have something that's completely white or peaking at 100 on your IRE scale. If you take this method and you apply it to that footage, you're gonna notice that it's gonna look unnatural and you're gonna be pulling it way out of context of how you actually shot it. So use discretion whenever you're using this technique. Make sure that it fits the end goal of what you're doing with your footage. Before we move on, I wanna talk a little bit more about adding contrast, and we can do that through something called the S-curve. An S-curve is basically formed by hitting your curves and putting a new point along the line, dragging it up, and then going down to the darker part of your image and then dragging that down. This is creating contrast by dragging the shadows and the darker regions of your footage down in exposure value and then dragging the more bright parts up. Put it simply, contrast is created by creating separation between the darker parts of your image and the brighter parts of your image. Contrast also makes things look sharper. Have you ever noticed how sharp a hair light looks on somebody when the sun is setting and it makes their hair and the image seem to pop? It's because the backlight that the sun is creating is making contrast between the brighter parts, the highlight, the hair light on your subject, and maybe the shadowed part, the parts that the sun isn't hitting. And that creates contrast, that creates sharpness, and makes your images much more punchy and beautiful. Now remember that these editing techniques with changing your white balance, doing an S-curve, using your curves can be used in any editing software out there. I just happen to be using Premiere, but these principles apply to all of them. Now we're gonna stay in the curves tab and we're gonna scroll down to one of the most overlooked curve manipulation tools that is out there, and that is the hue versus Luma sliders. Now with the hue versus Luma slider, you're actually able to pick a certain color and increase or decrease the brightness of that particular color. One of my least favorite things about the images that come out of my Sony a7S III and whatever picture profile I'm shooting in is how bright the greens are, how digital the greens look in my images. I really like to shoot landscape videography and epic elopements and travel videos and things like that, and so I'm shooting in a lot of places that have lush green landscapes, and I've noticed that a lot of times the green is overwhelming the image and isn't really drawing my eye to my subject, it's rather overwhelming it. In order to counteract that, I like to use the hue versus Luma slider. Now I don't really use this method whenever it comes to skin tone. I really like to use this in landscape situations where I'm modifying the brightness or the darkness of my greens. Simply put a point somewhere in the yellows going all the way through the greens and start dragging that down until your greens start to look exactly how you're wanting them to look in your images. Don't overdo this. This is just a really good way to make your subject pop more and take some of the emphasis off of your greens in your images. We just want to accentuate our subject a little bit more by taking down the luminance value of our greens. Now with the Wonderlets that I came out with this year, you'll see that I've already decreased the exposure values of my greens while also desaturating them and obviously doing a few more things to the color throughout the image, but this is a really cool way of being able to go ahead and skip the dragging the sliders and just throw a LUT onto your footage at a certain intensity to make it look how you're wanting it to look. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something called your Vectorscope. Now, I'm not going to talk about this one a ton, but this is a really good way of making sure that you have your skin tones look good in post if you didn't nail it whenever you're actually shooting your footage. What I like to do with the Vectorscope if my skin tones seem a little bit off is drag a mask around only the skin in my image. Once I've dragged a mask around it, my skin is the only thing that the Vectorscope is picking up any kind of color value for. You'll see the skin tone line laid out on the Vectorscope. From there you can pull in more green or more magenta or cool it down or warm it up in order to get your skin tones to fall right on that line. Now, this doesn't always work, but if your skin tones seem off whenever you get into the editing suite, draw a mask around them real quick, go ahead and look at that skin tone line in your Vectorscope and start playing with your magenta, with your greens, with your warmth, with cooling things down to see if you can get your skin tones to look more proper using the guide that the Vectorscope gives you. Using your lumetri scopes like your waveform or your Vectorscope are a really good way of being able to see what your images are going to look like across different platforms. We can't always trust where a computer screen that we're editing on is showing us as far as exposure values or color values. So we want to nail it as close as we can so that it looks universally good on a phone, a laptop, or a TV, or whatever your viewer is watching your footage on. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you guys with too much information here in part 2 of color grading, so the last thing I want to be talking about is your hue versus saturation slider. A lot of times if you have artifacting or noise that's going on in your drone footage or in your Sony footage, Canon, Panasonic, you name it, a lot of that artifacting is going to happen kind of in the shadows and your magenta and purple regions. To clean up our images so that the noise or that artifacting isn't as noticeable, we can go into our hue versus saturation slider, drag around our purples and our low blues, and pull that down so that the artifacting is less noticeable. This artifacting will generally happen in more of the gray areas of our footage, and so in order to make our footage look more clean, we can use this quick color grading technique to make our stuff look better. Now I'm really just kind of scratching the surface with these different techniques that I'm talking about, these few things that I've talked about in this video to help you and enhance your color grading. I would encourage you to not be scared and to dive into all these other curve sliders, all these other different things that you can do to make your skin tones look better, to make your greens look different, to make the artifacting go away. go watch other YouTube videos. But I want you guys to know that you can make your footage look good. The first thing you have to do is expose properly in camera. That is about 90% of the work. I promise you the stuff that I'm talking about right here is only the last 10% after you've shot in good light with proper exposure and nailed your white balance. Guys, I hope this video was helpful. If you did watch this video and you liked how my footage looked with my Wonderlets on them, you can go down to the description below, grab the discount code, and go get those Wonderlets for yourself to start putting on your footage today. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you did like this video, think about dropping a like, hit that subscribe button. Planning on coming out with more tutorials very soon for you guys to help you out with all things videography related. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll see you soon.